25 years ago, a respected pastor vanished after a winter sermon in a quiet southern town. No body, no note, just silence, and a community that quickly moved on. But when his son returns decades later after a cryptic phone call, a hidden letter, and a blood-stained Bible, he begins uncovering the truth no one dared to face. Then, beneath the church floorboards, he finds the first crack in a lie buried by faith, family, and fear. The city at late night was a cold, gray mass. The high-rise windows were devoid of light, and only the solitary sound of passing cars remained, like the heartbeat of someone trying to sleep, but unable to. Jacob Carter sat alone in his 17th-floor apartment, where the windows offered a view of a boulevard ablaze with light in the early hours, and empty as night fell. His desk was tidy, design files stacked neatly, the computer screen still illuminated with an unfinished interior design. He had stared at the drawing for 3 hours, yet hadn't made a single alteration. He was a renowned interior designer. Just type his name into a search engine, and a series of images of extravagant projects would appear. Model apartments, boutique hotels, elegantly styled Scandinavian executive offices. Behind it all was a quiet, professional man, somewhat aloof, according to the assessments of clients and colleagues. But behind the white light of the screen, in eyes that couldn't hide their weariness, was a man living with a void that had lasted 25 years. A void that bore no name, yet was always present. And then, the telephone rang, cutting through the silence like a sharp, icy blade. Jacob looked at the screen. Unknown number. Area code. St. Grace. He paused for a second. That southern town, from which he had left at the age of 13 and never returned, could only be where memories lay beneath a thick layer of dust. He hesitated, but then pressed the answer button. "Mr. Carter?" A man's voice resonated with the slow, deliberate rhythm typical of the South, but touched with urgency. "I'm Deputy Sheriff Monroe from the St. Grace Police Department. Sorry for calling so late, but I thought you should know." Jacob stood up, his hand tightening around the phone. "We're renovating the old church, St. Grace Baptist. While removing the pulpit, the construction crew discovered a small hidden chamber beneath it. There was a wooden chest." He paused for a moment, then continued, as if weighing each word. "Inside was a clerical robe, a Bible with the name David Carter on it, and an unsent letter." The room suddenly felt colder. Jacob didn't respond. Mr. Monroe was also silent, as if both of them could hear an invisible sound across the 1,000-mile distance, the echo of something that had been forgotten for far too long. "I think you should come home," the sheriff said softly. Jacob hung up without another word. He slumped back into his chair. His mind was blank. David Carter, his father, the pastor who had preached every Sunday morning under the church's dome, had disappeared one cold winter night in 1980 after his final service. No message, no trace. The police investigated for a few weeks and then closed the case as if he had simply vanished. Jacob still clearly remembered that morning, his mother trembling as she made calls everywhere, then sitting and holding him on the porch. People said he might have left, unable to cope after his wife's death. Jacob never believed it, but he never dared to ask further. The night seemed to flood into the apartment. He stood up, walked towards the wooden shelf where only a single framed photograph was placed, an old, faded picture. His father stood on the pulpit, holding a Bible, the light from the stained glass windows behind him creating a faint halo. His mother sat in the front row, smiling gently. Jacob stared at his father's face. That face had once been familiar, then became strange, and now seemed to be looking back at him. That gaze, was it kindness or disappointment? He opened his computer, typed Saint, type Grace Baptist Church into the search bar. There weren't many images. Just an old red brick church, a tall bell tower, and a backyard covered with dry leaves. Not a single sign to indicate that this place had once been the starting point for a tragedy. The letter. the name etched on the Bible, the old robe, and a church without a pastor. Jacob sat down at his desk, opened his laptop. But his hand couldn't control the mouse anymore. That night he couldn't do anything, couldn't sleep, couldn't work. Only the photograph and jumbled memories lingered like smoldering cigarette smoke. Near dawn, he opened his suitcase, packed a few sets of clothes, didn't tell anyone. Wrote a short, concise email requesting a leave of absence. Only wrote one line in his work log: going home. On the plane, he opened the letter that had been sent as a scanned copy via email from the sheriff. His father's familiar handwriting, slightly slanted, somewhat rigid. The first lines were an unfinished message, as if written hastily. If you are reading this, then I am no longer here, but God still is. Jacob read that sentence over and over, unsure if he was feeling tension. God still is? The flight landed the next afternoon. The southern wind carried the scent of earth and moisture. When he set foot in St. Grace, the first thing Jacob felt wasn't the air of his hometown, but something unfinished. He didn't come to investigate. He wasn't a policeman, nor someone with a strong belief in the truth. He returned because he wanted to close the door that he had left ajar since childhood. To close it, not to open it. St. Grace greeted Jacob with a tranquil sky and rows of low houses covered in moss. The small town seemed unchanged after 25 years. Stone-paved streets, faded wooden eaves, old oak trees casting shadows on the sidewalk, all as if trying to hold on to the memory of a child who once rode his bike under those trees, calling for his father in the late afternoon. Jacob drove his rental car onto the main road, slowing down as he passed the old ice cream shop. The owner still sat there, his hair white, holding a plastic cup of coffee, watching the sky like a guardian of time. He didn't stop. In the distance, the bell tower of St. Grace Baptist Church gradually came into view. Red brick, large oak doors, a tall tower reaching towards the sky, just like in the old photograph he still kept, except now the paint was peeling, and the lawn in front was no longer neatly trimmed. A group of workers were carrying wooden planks and repair equipment. Jacob pulled the car to the curb. The iron gate creaked as he pushed it open gently, feeling like he was entering a world that had been frozen, waiting for a breath to touch it and shatter it. Jacob, the voice came from the side door of the church. A man wearing a white shirt, sleeves rolled up, approached, thin, with salt and pepper hair, but his eyes still bright as ever. Reverend Paul Whitaker. Jacob nodded. You're older than I remember. Reverend Paul chuckled softly. And you look remarkably like your father, every line. When I heard you were coming back, I couldn't believe it. Jacob only smiled faintly. He didn't intend to stay long, didn't intend to bring up the past. But Paul's gaze lingered longer than necessary as he looked at him, as if searching for something beyond the greeting. Did you receive the letter? Paul asked. And the Bible. Jacob replied, his eyes not leaving the church door. Paul pondered. I used to be your father's student. He was the one who guided me, the first one who believed I could preach. His disappearance has always been a wound in this community. Jacob turned to look directly into his eyes. Did you ever think he didn't disappear? Paul was silent for a second, then replied softly as a passing breeze. There were times I thought so. At Uncle Thomas's house, lunch was ready as if they had been waiting for him for days. The tall, red-faced man came out and hugged Jacob as if no years had passed. Lord, look at you, just like David's son. Oh, I'm so glad. Jacob stood still in that too tight embrace. This house, once where he was sent whenever his father was busy, still retained the scent of pine wood and fried fat. Family photos hung all over the walls, but none had his father's face after 1980. How have you been, Uncle? Jacob asked, sitting down on the wooden chair with a worn cushion. Still the same. The church is short of people, but I'm old now. Just helping to look after the finances a little. Oh, here are some of your favorites. Baked apple pie, chicken waffles, grilled ribs. I remember. Jacob looked at the overflowing table, feeling like he was back in his childhood, when he still had enough father, mother, and Uncle Thomas. Have you been to the cemetery yet? Thomas asked during the meal. Jacob nodded. I'll go later. Thomas paused for a beat. You know, your mother was a good woman. And David, he was a complicated man. Jacob didn't say anything. A small drop of sweat ran from his uncle's temple down his collar, something the mild weather today couldn't explain. The town cemetery nestled on the edge of the forest, peaceful and well cared for. The grass was green, the headstones clean, dried flowers placed in simple ceramic vases. Jacob's mother's grave was in the third row, next to the white fence. The headstone read, Anna Carter, mother, wife, friend of God. Jacob stood by the low wooden fence of the cemetery, his eyes still focused on his mother's grave, a small, simple, but elegant headstone. There was nothing to mention David, nor was there anyone to ask him the reason. The wind blew, gently swaying the old willow branches in the distance. A leaf fell on his shoulder. He brushed it off, then sighed, not because of fatigue, but because he had just realized this entire town had learned to live without having to confront the memory. The sound of shoes crunching on gravel came from behind. Still the same, isn't it? A familiar female voice rose from behind. Jacob turned around. Elise stood there, arms crossed, still trim in her faded khaki jacket, her hair in a high bun, her eyes sharp as if she had just stepped out of a boardroom, even though she was in the middle of a cemetery. You haven't changed much, she said, walking closer. Only your eyes are more tired. Jacob smiled slightly, even though his heart skipped a beat as a memory surged back. Elise, the girlfriend from years ago who used to argue with him about everything, from politics to the Bible, from how to cook Southern cornbread to whether to forgive a traitor or not. They had once been two curious children, growing up in the church rows, strolling through town after school, writing each other's names on library desks. Then each went their own way after the incomplete mourning of his family. Now, she was the town's only reporter, working for a newspaper that lived mainly on advertisements from the laundromat and grocery store. But her eyes, still sharp as ever, only now, instead of rebelling, those eyes had learned to be more patient with life. Elise looked towards the headstone, then said, her voice lower, You know, Jacob, she said slowly, I once wrote an article about your father's disappearance, but the editor wouldn't let me publish it. The reason was, don't stir up the past, people are comfortable. Jacob smiled faintly. Comfortable on what? On a lie? Elise didn't answer, just looked straight into his eyes. And in that moment, Jacob knew. She was one of the very few people in this town, if not the only one, who had never stopped believing that David Carter hadn't disappeared, but had been erased by someone. That sentence fell like a pebble into a calm lake. It didn't create waves, but it sank very deep. In his memory, David Carter was tall, with a deep voice and a habit of ruffling his hair every Sunday morning. He wasn't a legend, just a father. But even that simple memory was being blurred by time. Jacob pulled the car over to the side of the road. He closed his eyes, sighed. Amid the childhood symbols that were still intact, it was the person who gave all the meaning to them who had disappeared as if he had never existed. And that was what made him unable to leave anymore. St. Grace Church in the morning carried a special solemnity. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, falling on the wooden pews, creating bands of cold light. The scent of old wood, the dampness of ancient brick walls, and something like the scent of long-standing time, all wrapped around each other, wrapping around Jacob as he pushed open the main door and stepped inside. Footsteps echoed in the empty sanctuary. Workers were taking a break outside. The whole space seemed to pause, reserved only for him and the questions no one dared to ask. He walked towards the pulpit, where his father once stood, once raised the Bible, once read prayers for weddings, baptisms, or for someone about to pass away. Jacob touched the smooth wooden surface, worn away by the years, and suddenly felt his heart tighten. For so many years, he had tricked himself into thinking that he didn't need his father, didn't need an explanation. But just standing where he once stood, he knew the longing never left him. A small wooden chest was placed temporarily in the corner of the pulpit. Jacob knelt down, opened the lid. Inside was the faded white robe, the gold thread on the trim worn, a Bible with a rough black leather cover, the name David Carter embossed below, and an envelope still sealed. He picked up the Bible first. The cover was soft and loose, evidence of frequent use. Flipping through it, he saw countless handwritten notes in the margins, circled passages, underlined sections, keywords like righteousness, forgiveness, truth in darkness. A page was marked with a faded ribbon located in Romans. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God. The lower left corner of the paper had a dark brown stain. Jacob leaned closer. Not ink, not coffee, something that had dried and soaked into the paper. Blood? A cold thought ran down his spine. His hand trembling slightly, he put the Bible down, then picked up the still sealed envelope. An old envelope, the paper slightly yellowed, but the name of the recipient was still clear. Jacob. Inside was a letter, handwritten, his father's handwriting, slanted and firm as he remembered. My son, if you are reading this, then I am no longer here. But God still is. Don't let my disappearance cause you to lose sight of him. Jacob swallowed hard. Each word seemed to be written with tears. I have witnessed something no one wants to see, but I believe, even if I depart, the seeds of justice will still grow in the hearts of those who still hold faith. You may be angry with me, hate me, but remember, darkness only wins when light gives up the fight. He didn't know how long he had sat there. He only knew that his heart was surging. There was a fierce struggle between contempt for his father's silence for so many years and the compassion that was gradually rising from the deepest layer of memory. As the sunlight turned to the pale orange of the afternoon, Jacob stood up, walked out of the pulpit, intending to return, when he accidentally saw a small wooden drawer under the lectern. Old, dusty, but not locked. He pulled it open gently. An old, thick, leather-bound notebook fell out. The first page read, Financial Records, Community Relief Fund, Nitin si Tito till Nitin Otito. Bookkeeper, Thomas Carter, his uncle's name. Jacob quickly flipped through the pages. Numbers, income, expenses, invoices, names of recipients of support. But the closer he got to the end of the book, the clearer the abnormality became. The amount of money spent increased sharply, but without recording the recipient. Special support, request for non-disclosure. He photographed a few pages with his phone, then put the notebook in his backpack. In the evening, he sought out Reverend Paul, who was still at the church after working hours. Reverend, Jacob said directly, do you know anything about the money in the relief fund in the late 1980s? My uncle signed it. Paul looked up from his desk. His face became serious. That's old news, Jacob. Many things have changed. Many people are no longer here either. But there is one person who still is, Jacob said, and that person is my father. Paul looked at him for a long time, then stood up, slowly walked towards the window. David Carter always believed that forgiveness was the only way to keep the heart from rotting. He tried to have a dialogue, hoped that those who were wrong could turn around. And they turned around by killing him? Jacob growled. Paul was silent. After a moment, he said, his voice as if echoing from a distant place, there are some truths that should only be judged by God. Jacob laughed coldly. Or are there some sins that even those people don't dare face? Paul didn't answer, but his eyes for a moment had something broken. That night, Jacob returned to the motel. He sat alone, reopened his father's Bible. staring at the dried bloodstain in the corner of the page. His mind kept repeating one thought: if his father was killed, then the person who did it was still living freely, still living in this church, still preaching, still holding honor, and perhaps still sleeping peacefully every night. A voice rose in Jacob's head, not his father's, nor anyone else's, just the vague voice of an urge. Don't stop. Under the dust of time, the first pieces of the puzzle had just been revealed, and they were not lying still. The library of St. Grace Church was on the top floor, where few people went. The room was long and narrow, the walls lined with dark wood, the ceiling low, the dim yellow light shining on the silent bookshelves. The scent of old paper, leather covers, faded ink, all created a heavy atmosphere, as if stepping into a memory that had been forgotten. Jacob pushed open the heavy wooden door, pausing slightly when he saw that everything was still intact. Long rows of reading tables with armchairs, numbered cabinets, a dusty file storage corner. Perhaps this place had not been used regularly since the day his father disappeared. "Elise?" he called softly. She came out from behind a bookshelf holding a stack of documents. Still the straight posture, sharp eyes, and neatly tied hair. But at this moment, she seemed more pensive than usual. Most of the old files have been put down in the basement, but there are still some papers that the pastor kept private. I think if your father ever tried to record anything, it would be in this place. Jacob nodded, walking over to her. They both began to flip through each stack of documents: sermon manuscripts, letters with the community, baptism registration books, and many unsent letters. Elise pulled out a small wooden box with a rusted metal latch. She opened it. Inside was a black cassette tape labeled in red ink. The Last Conversation, December 13th, 1980. They looked at each other. Jacob's heart seemed to stop for a second. "The old pastor's room still has a tape player," Elise said softly. No one spoke as they walked down the narrow stairs, holding the tape as if holding a part of the remains. The pastor's room was small, the walls covered with old wallpaper, still with the original wooden table and chairs. The cassette player was dusty, but still working after plugging it in. Jacob pressed play. A crackling sound rose, accompanied by a rustling sound like clothes touching chairs, then a deep, warm voice, David Carter. "Thomas, I didn't come to accuse you. I came so that you could look straight at me and at God." A second voice rose, low and unpleasant. "Thomas, David, I told you, don't interfere in other people's affairs." "Not other people. People who need help. From the church fund, the relief fund, that you stopped. I did that to maintain stability. You don't understand finances. Save one poor person, then what? The whole town comes? We are a church, not a bank." There was the sound of a chair being pushed hard, footsteps, heavy breathing. Then David said slowly, "I will tell the community. They have the right to know." "You dare?" Thomas almost shouted. "Who do you think you are? Are you a saint?" Then, the sound of something hitting hard, a staggering sound, and a gasp. After that, silence. There were no more voices. Jacob froze. His hands squeezed the chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Elise was still looking straight at the player, not saying a word. No screaming, no blood. But it was the final silence that made Jacob's stomach clench. They didn't speak for almost 10 minutes. Only the rewind sound of the machine as Jacob carefully rewound it, then removed the tape, putting it in his inside pocket. "It's no coincidence that this tape hasn't been destroyed," Elise said first. "Someone, maybe Paul, kept it, but never released it." Jacob nodded slightly, his eyes still staring blankly at the old wall. The old question repeated in his head, this time no longer a doubt, but a choked affirmation. His father did not leave. He was pushed away. More precisely, he was pushed out of this world. Back in the library, Elise continued to search. A collection of handwritten letters was tied with twine, labeled Community Correspondence, 1979 to 1980. They opened it, reading each letter. Many letters were from believers sent to David, asking for help, asking for advice, asking for financial support. Some wrote in despair, "My husband lost his job. I am asking for a small amount to pay for medicine for my child. I came 3 times, and Mr. Thomas refused me every time. Pastor, I know you don't have the power, but I believe you understand what is just better than anyone else." Jacob felt his heart being squeezed. Each word on the paper was like a silent scream. And his father had tried to listen. He saw a draft of a letter from David without a clear recipient, only dated. In it, he wrote, "I understand that justice is not always pleasing to people, but I cannot continue to preach if my heart is divided between silence and truth." Elise leaned back against the bookshelf, closing her eyes. That night, I remember. Jacob looked at her. "Elise?" he asked. She nodded. The night Pastor David disappeared. I was walking past the hallway, intending to go to the tutoring room to get a book. I heard an argument in the pastor's room. I knew it was Mr. Thomas's voice. I didn't dare go in. Jacob didn't speak. Elise opened her eyes, her gaze deep. The next morning, he disappeared. No one reported it to the police immediately. No one searched. It was just gone. People accepted it too quickly, as if they were used to it already. A long silence passed between them. Jacob breathed out, closing his eyes. This was no longer an investigation. This was a meeting between memory and the gaps in memory, between what he thought was the closed past and the truth trying to cry out from the dusty drawers. When leaving the library, Jacob took the tape, the collection of letters, and his father's diary, as if carrying the spiritual remains of someone who had passed away. He no longer doubted. He was beginning to know for sure. David Carter's death was not accidental. It was an act, deliberate, calculated, and shrouded in the complicity of silence. And now, that silence was beginning to crack. Jacob returned to Uncle Thomas's house. He opened the door in a short-sleeved shirt, holding a glass of iced tea, a warm, friendly smile. And today, a little embarrassed. "Jacob, come in, nephew. I was just thinking about you." Thomas poured more tea for Jacob and sat down in his familiar armchair. "I heard you found some things in the church. It's just old news. Digging it up will only make people more sad." Jacob was not polite. "I found a tape, recording my father and you in the pastor's room, the night he disappeared." Thomas paused, for a tick, but enough for Jacob to see clearly. He put the teacup down, trying to keep his voice calm. "Maybe you misheard. It's been a long time. Number, I recognize your voice, and my father's voice. A son can't not recognize his father." Thomas sighed, turning his face towards the window. David. He was a good man, but he always saw things in black and white. While this world, it's not that simple. "What do you want to say?" "I don't deny that there were times of arguments, but David, he forgave. Do you know that he used to write handwritten letters to me, saying that he didn't want to bring the story to the community?" Jacob stared at his uncle, and then he disappeared. What a coincidence, don't you think? Thomas stood up, walking slowly to the wooden cabinet next to the wall, opened it, took out an old photo frame. "Here, look at this. Decades ago, the spring festival at the churchyard. Me and your father, standing together serving lemonade to the kids." Jacob held the photo frame. In the picture, his father and Thomas were standing next to each other, holding trays, smiling. But in the right corner of the photo, near his father's shoulder, there was a light but very clear scratch, as if someone had intentionally torn a line, then pasted it back. "This, who did it?" Jacob asked, his voice low. Thomas shrugged. "Maybe it's because of cleaning." Jacob put the photo frame on the table, not because of the scratch, but because for the first time, he smelled lies in a place that used to be a refuge in childhood. That evening, Jacob returned to Elise's house. She was sitting at a small desk by the window with a bank statement on the screen. "Elise, have you found anything yet?" he asked, his voice hoarse. She didn't answer immediately, just tilted the screen towards him. A bank transaction was clearly displayed, a transfer of $3,200 from the St. Grace Church Relief Fund to Thomas Carter's personal account on December 10, 1980. "4 days before your father disappeared," Elise said softly. "There are at least 3 more like that." Jacob clenched his hands tightly. A cold feeling spread from his palms to his chest. No more doubts. "Can you print these things?" "Already printed," Elise replied. Both statements and requests for assistance that Thomas used to refuse. Jacob took the stack of papers, walked out. He didn't remember how he drove back to the motel. Everything in his head was just echoes, his father's voice, firm, pleading, then silent, and then the circumvention, lies, and a bloody smile covering the truth. That night, Jacob couldn't sleep. He fell asleep in a state of half-awake, half-dream, and in the dream, he saw his father again. David Carter stood in the sanctuary of the old church holding the Bible. The light shining through the stained glass window fell on his shoulders like a halo. But this time, he didn't preach, didn't move, didn't say a word. He just looked at Jacob, his eyes sad but steady. Behind him were empty pews covered in dust. Under the pulpit, as if there was a crack, from which a faint light escaped, dazzling. Jacob raised his hand, intending to step forward, but as soon as he set foot on the pulpit, he disappeared. The room darkened. Only he remained, and the silence covered everything. Jacob startled awake, his heart racing. The clock read 3:12 a.m. He turned on the light, sat up, poured water to drink, but still couldn't swallow the lump in his throat. He stepped out of the room, standing in front of the long corridor. At the end of the corridor, there was a wall hanging pictures, where the motel owner hung old photos of the church and local residents. He walked closer, looking at each one. There was a large photo taken at the church festival in 1979. In the photo, his father stood in the middle of the crowd, raising the Bible. Next to him was Thomas, turning to the other side, a half-hearted smile. Right in the bottom corner of the photo, someone had drawn a blue ballpoint pen across David's face. Jacob stared blankly. He didn't know whose hand had done it, but in his head only a sound rang out, broken. He reached out and ripped the photo off the wall. The glass shattered, pieces falling to the floor. Jacob didn't move. He looked down at his hand, bleeding, but not feeling pain. Sometimes blood ties don't save a soul, and justice doesn't flow in the same bloodline. At noon that day, it was sweltering. The air was still, without even a light breeze. Jacob and Elise went together back to the old warehouse behind the church, once used to store liturgical items, pastor's robes, Christmas decorations, and things that no one wanted to look back on. The warehouse was closed with a rusty iron lock. Elise opened it with the key that Reverend Paul gave her from last year's community meeting, in case you need to clean up. When the door opened, a musty, old, and rotten wood smell hit her nose. They stepped inside. Light streamed through the corrugated iron roof, creating blurred streaks of light in the dust-filled space. Everything seemed to have been forgotten for a long time. Wooden barrels, rotten bookshelves, an old pastor's outfit covered with white cloth. Jacob walked along the shelves while Elise bent down to rummage through the cardboard boxes in the corner of the room. "Jacob," Elise called softly. "Come here." In her hand was a discolored envelope, sealed with broken red wax. There was no recipient address. Only 4 words, never to be sent. Jacob opened the envelope, took out a handwritten letter, yellowed paper, neat slanted handwriting in a classic style of someone who used to preach with standard words. "Anna, there are things I have never said and now I only know to write them down to erase some of what has been deeply embedded in my heart." Jacob read this. His hand tightened slightly. Anna, his mother. "I don't hate David, but I hate his eyes. The eyes of someone who always thinks he is on the bright side, while those like me are waiting at the bottom. I love you, Anna. Not the great love that poets write, but a smoldering feeling. Starting from the time you stepped into the Bible study class holding an old book, your gaze never belonged to anyone. But you chose David, and I chose to remain silent, chose to stand behind him, chose to survive, instead of loving honestly." Jacob folded the letter, looking at Elise. She didn't say anything. But in her eyes was a silent sharing, not only because of those words, but because Jacob was facing another layer of his family's memory, where there was hurt, jealousy, and a love that had never been named. That afternoon, Jacob went to find Reverend Paul. He was sitting in his office, the light from the stained glass window behind him shining on his wrinkled shirt. He didn't look surprised when he saw Jacob walk in, just nodded slightly, inviting him to sit down. Jacob didn't sit. He took out the letter, placing it on the table. "I've read it," he said, his voice calm but not cold. "The letter you wrote to my mother." Paul looked at the envelope, his eyes not avoiding. A long moment of silence. Then he breathed out. "There are many things that people never intend to say, but it still lives inside us, lingering like a scar that doesn't heal." Jacob nodded. "You loved my mother." "Yes," Paul replied, "and she loved your father." For the first time, he looked up, looking straight at Jacob. No defensiveness, just a naked look of someone who has lived too long with what he never received. "You know, David is someone everyone respects, but with him, everything is either right or wrong. There is no room for weakness, no gray area. For someone like me, always in the gray area, that was too big a shadow." "So you hated him?" Paul shook his head. "I was jealous, and when I saw that he was going to expose the money in the fund, I didn't stop Thomas. I was complicit, silent, not stopping, not denouncing. And that killed him." His voice choked up. "I didn't directly take action, but I stood there, watching, and not doing anything." Jacob looked at the man in front of him, who used to preach about forgiveness, about faith and righteousness, now stripped of all pretense, only a naked soul with regret eating away at him every day. "Come with me," Paul said after a moment of silence. "I need to show you something." They drove to the church cemetery but didn't stop at the main entrance. Paul turned onto the dirt road behind, which used to be a burial area for town residents' pets, now abandoned. They stopped in front of a small, unmarked grave, with only a thin stone that read a faded word: "Sparky, friend of all children." Paul pointed to it. "We, Thomas and I, dug up that dog's grave, put your father's body down, poured cement on it. No one suspected." The wind blew, shaking the weeds. Jacob stood still, not saying anything. His chest felt empty. "We were afraid. And when afraid, people choose the living over the right. But I know, I lost myself from that day on." He knelt down, his hands placed on the thin stone. The kneeling posture of someone begging not for forgiveness, but for a chance to touch humanity one last time. "I loved her, but David was the one she chose," Paul whispered, tears falling on the grass. Jacob looked at him and saw another image of loss. Not death, but a life that lasted without meaning. A life sunk by the wrong choice. On the way back, no one spoke. Jacob looked out the window, seeing the sunset pouring down on the old houses, the light stained red on the dry ground. He didn't know if he forgave Paul or not, but he knew today he had just touched a part of the truth that he didn't dare name for a long time. That justice is not always glorified, but repentance, when genuine, can become a beautiful atonement. Night fell on the town of St. Grace like a thick charcoal blanket. The wind was cool, but not cold. Clouds drifted quietly across the dark sky, obscuring most of the starlight. The church cemetery was deserted. Only the chirping of insects and Jacob's footsteps mixed in the gravel under his feet. He brought a small candle, some matches, a leather-bound notebook, the last diary of his father, just found after the police preliminarily confirmed the location of the unnamed grave under that thin stone was indeed human remains. Jacob didn't ask for permission, didn't tell anyone. He just felt he had to come. In front of the grave, he knelt down, wiping the dust on the stone, even though he knew the person lying underneath could no longer hear. Placed the small candle in the weeds, lit it. The dim light trembled, like his heart at this moment. He opened the diary. David's handwriting, still slanted, still firm, but thicker, denser on the last pages. Under the candlelight, he read, "I used to believe that justice was something that had to be implemented immediately. But now I understand. It is a seed, sown, buried, and only germinates in the hearts of those who still retain faith." Jacob turned the page. "I'm afraid. I'm not as brave as everyone thinks, but I believe that if I remain silent, I will lose myself and lose the soul of my son." The wind shook the flame. Jacob leaned over, shielding it with his hand, his eyes stinging. He turned to the last page, perhaps written on that fateful night. Just a single line. "Death does not take away the truth. It only covers the light with a veil waiting to be lifted." Jacob let go. The wind blew, making the candle tilt, then stand firm again. A memory suddenly flooded back. When he was 6 years old, the whole town lost power during a summer storm. His mother looked for candles in the kitchen, while he, who was more afraid of the dark than thunder, cried in the living room. His father picked him up, gently as if carrying a child made of thread. David didn't say much, just sat down, held him in his arms and sang softly a hymn he had never heard before. The wind outside was still howling, the rain lashed against the windows, but that embrace and that song were the only light he needed then. And tonight, this candle, where his father was lying, was the light continuing from that embrace. "I used to ask him," Elise said softly from behind. Jacob startled, turning around. Elise walked lightly, holding a bouquet of white flowers. "I come here every year, but I wasn't sure where he was. Now I know." She knelt down next to him, placing the flowers in front of the grave. "Elise," Jacob whispered, "why do you still believe?" She looked at him, her eyes not blazing as when arguing, but quiet, like a deep well. "Because I remember one time, when my mother passed away, I wandered behind the church. David saw me crying, didn't say anything. Then, he just put his hand on my shoulder and said, 'You don't need to understand all of God. Just believe that he is still there.'" Jacob looked at the candle burning peacefully. In him, the wall of reason that had been built for 25 years began to crack, not rumbling, not fierce, but quietly, like the way truth often is quiet. He knelt down, for the first time in many years, not to ask for anything, but just to talk to a father he had never forgiven. "I'm here, Dad, not because I want revenge, but because I want to know, am I like you? And if so, is that a bad thing?" There was no answer, only the wind and the candle still burning steadily. A small noise rang out behind him. Jacob turned around. A boy, about 7 or 8 years old, stood a few meters away, a coat too big for him, holding a plastic bag of bread. "Are you Jacob?" he asked. Jacob nodded. Before he could ask anything, the boy continued, "I'm Eli. You gave me a winter coat last year, at the support center." Jacob was stunned. He remembered. The curly-haired boy standing shivering under the eaves of the rain when giving out charity gifts. He had given him his old coat, not thinking much. "I saw you in the newspaper, talking about Pastor Carter. He's your father, right?" Jacob nodded. Eli walked closer, timidly. "I don't have a father, but if I could choose, I would want my father to be like him." or like you. That word, unprepared, not fabricated, like a knife piercing through all the defenses in Jacob's heart. He bent down, placing his hand on the boy's shoulder, nodded. "Thank you. I'm so glad to hear that." As Eli left, Elise stood up, saying softly, "That boy doesn't need many sermons, just someone who is sincere." Jacob stood silently, his eyes still following Eli's small figure leaving the cemetery. Then he looked at the grave, where the small candle was still burning. No one else stood here except him. But Jacob no longer felt alone. "Dad," he said silently, "I don't promise to forgive everything, but I promise to live up to what you believed, and I believe you never left." The lights of St. Grace Church shone brightly that night, quite different from the silence and darkness in Jacob's memory. The light from the decorative lights running along the wooden pillars, shining on the old stone walls and stained glass windows, made the scene look like a Christmas Eve. But instead of singing, today people came to hear the truth. The seats in the main sanctuary were full. The elderly, the young, the believers who had left the church, and those who had never set foot in this place in 2 decades were also present. News of the memorial service for Pastor David Carter had spread quickly throughout the town after a short article by Elise in the local newspaper. On the pulpit, for the first time in 25 years, Jacob stood there, not in a robe, not with a Bible, but only with a cassette tape and his father's diary. Elise sat in the first row, next to some elderly former believers. Reverend Paul and Thomas Carter were also present, sitting in the second row, not far from Jacob, their faces pale but not protesting. They both knew the silence had come to an end. Jacob looked at the entire community, those eyes not resentful, not accusing, but the eyes of someone who could no longer keep the pain in silence. He began with a very short sentence. "Today I do not stand here to condemn. I stand here to lift the veil that has covered the light for 25 years." He turned on the player. The crackling sound rose. Then the familiar recording spoke. His father's voice, calm, serious, echoed through the sanctuary. "Thomas, I didn't come to accuse you. I came so that you could look straight at me and at God." The entire room was silent. No one coughed, no one moved. Only the argument, the gasping breath, and finally, the blow, the stagger, the gasp, then the prolonged silence. When the tape stopped, a real silence covered the sanctuary. Then Jacob continued. "My father, David Carter, did not leave. He was silenced by those he believed to be fellow believers, by the silence of those who knew the truth but chose to turn their backs." Elise stood up, walking to Jacob's side. She held David's diary, her voice trembling but clear. Excerpt from the diary of December 11th, 1980, 2 days before he disappeared. "I know who did what. I'm not afraid of them. I'm only afraid of what will happen if I don't speak up. And if my voice is not heard, I hope one day my son's voice will sound in my place." A sob rang out in the middle row. An old man with white hair, leaning on a cane, stood up trembling. He looked down at his feet, then looked up to face Jacob. "That night," he said softly, "I saw Thomas walk out of the church at about nearly midnight. His hands were stained with something. I didn't dare ask. I should have said it long ago, but I was afraid." No one condemned him, but everyone heard clearly that the confession was heavier than any accusation. A middle-aged woman stood up after that, her eyes red. "I was told to remain silent," she said. "Mr. Thomas told me not to ask any more questions, that Jacob's father had wronged the church. But I know. David was the one who brought my son out of addiction, the only one who dared to come to my house when the whole community turned their backs. He did not deserve to be buried under cement and lies." Whispers spread throughout the church. A light wind blew through the windows, making the candles flicker, but not go out. At the end of the sanctuary, 2 uniformed police officers walked in. One nodded slightly to Jacob. He pointed to Paul and Thomas. Thomas Carter bowed his head. No resistance, not saying a word. Paul Whitaker stood up. His eyes met Jacob's eyes one last time. No more fear, no more excuses. As the police officer put the cuffs on, Paul didn't dodge. He voluntarily put his hands forward, and before being led away, he turned his face towards the pulpit, where David Carter used to stand, and whispered just enough for Jacob to hear, "David, I was wrong." When the church doors closed behind those arrested, silence covered once again. But this time, it was not suffocation, but purification. Jacob returned to the pulpit. He looked down at the faces that were quietly shedding tears, then gently placed his hand on the wooden surface where his father had touched. If any of us ever thought the truth didn't matter anymore, then today we were wrong. But the good thing is, the truth doesn't die. It's just waiting for someone brave enough to call its name. No one applauded. No one said anything. But everyone's eyes were different, heavy, then gradually brightened. Elise came closer to him, gently placing her hand on his shoulder. They didn't need to say anything more, because tonight, the truth had been heard. And David Carter, for the first time in 25 years, had been mentioned by his real name, with his deserved position. The month of March was cold enough to make people pull up their collars, but the sun was gentle enough to bring a promise of spring. The entire St. Grace Cemetery that morning seemed to be covered with a new layer of light, although there were no flowers, no music, no elaborate rituals, only solemn silence and a dark brown oak coffin placed neatly on the newly dug grave, this time a real grave for someone the town had once rejected. Jacob stood there, his head bowed. Next to him was Elise, the old believers who had heard David Carter preach, the young people who had never known him but had come, bringing white flowers. No one ordered, no one called. They brought them themselves, simple flowers, placed in newspaper, but bearing a meaning that only time could wash away. Forgiveness. Police had confirmed that the remains found under the pet cemetery stone were indeed of Pastor David Carter, using DNA from an old wooden comb that Anna used to keep. The documents were signed, the coffin was lifted from the unworthy place and now buried where he deserved to lie. The leader of the funeral was not Reverend Paul, nor a new pastor. No one was assigned. Jacob was the first to step up. He didn't hold paper, didn't have a long speech, just stood there looking down at the coffin and speaking as if speaking to someone who was still listening. "Dad, this is what I should have done a long time ago. But like you, I needed time to walk the whole path, to know that the truth doesn't need to be rushed, just be persistent." He bent down, scooping each shovelful of earth, sprinkling it on the coffin lid with his own hands. No one stopped him. No one interrupted. The sound of earth touching wood was not loud, but each fall seemed to compress thousands of days and months of silence. After the burial, the people went forward one by one, without pushing, without saying much. Just bowed their heads, placing white flowers. A middle-aged man whispered, "He used to teach me to forgive. Now it's my turn to learn to apologize." A young woman brought her young child. The child held a bouquet of wildflowers. He didn't know who David Carter was. But when he looked at Jacob, he said very softly, "Are you his son?" Then he must have been a very good person. Jacob just nodded, his throat choked. At the end of the ceremony, a group of young people stepped up. They wore white shirts, carrying a handwritten sign, "Faith Revived, Community Charity Program for David Carter." They bowed their heads before the grave, then gave Jacob a preliminary plan, including activities to support the homeless, Bible classes for teenagers, and a listening cafe model for those who need to share. Jacob was speechless. No need to applaud, no need for medals. Just one sentence from the leader of the group made him want to cry. "We can't change the past, but we can start again from the pain of that past." When everyone had gone almost, only Jacob and Elise remained. They sat next to each other on the stone bench next to the cemetery. The old oak tree next to them rustled in the wind. "I remember your father," Elise said, her eyes looking far away. "He wasn't perfect, but he always stepped into places that others didn't dare to go, and he never abandoned anyone." Jacob squeezed her hand gently. For the first time, after so many years apart, they held hands, not because of romance, but because in that moment, they both needed a hand that could still hold warmth. The wind blew lightly, making the last page of his father's diary fly away. The page he had marked for a long time. Jacob bent down, picking it up, opened it, reading again the sentence he had memorized. "If you are reading this, then I am no longer here, but God still is." Elise looked at him. "Do you believe it?" Jacob nodded slightly. "I'm not sure God always answers, but I believe he never turns his back." The afternoon sun shone through the foliage, casting shadows on the brand new headstone with the words, "David Carter, 1947-1980. The light never fades, only waiting for someone faithful enough to turn it on. Jacob didn't cry anymore. He just sat there, his eyes looking at the sky that was gradually turning amber. In him, there was no more anger, no more demands, only a strange quietness, as if the soul of his father had found his way home, and he finally could leave without carrying the open questions. St. Grace Church was strangely quiet that morning. No bells, no parishioners. Only the gentle light of the early morning shone through the stained glass windows, covering the wooden pews and brick walls with a hazy color like ancient stained glass. Jacob sat in the third row, back straight, his eyes looking at the empty pulpit. There was no one preaching, but he still sat there, not to wait for anyone, but to listen to the silence. Next to him was Eli, the orphaned boy he had helped last winter. Today, the boy wore a dark coat, his hair neatly combed, his hands clasped together on his lap. He was silent for a long time, then looked up and asked a question very softly, but as if echoing through the sanctuary. "Do you believe God was there when your father died?" Jacob turned, looking into those childish eyes. It wasn't the first time he had heard that question. He had asked himself that question hundreds of times, in his sleep, in late-night car rides, in the times he looked at his father's picture and felt his heart empty. This time, he didn't answer immediately, just smiled slightly, then said, "Your father used to say, God doesn't always speak up, but he is always present." The boy blinked. Jacob recounted as if whispering to himself, "A long time ago, in a sermon that I still remember, my father said that there are times when God is silent, not because he doesn't care, but because he is standing next to us, holding our hand, until we are calm enough to hear his word in our own hearts." Eli nodded as if he understood. Or maybe he didn't understand everything, but in his eyes was the peace that Jacob had lost. A streak of sunlight from the east window gradually filled the pulpit, where the dust had been wiped clean, where for 25 years no one had dared to step up to say anything real. Jacob stood up, stepping step by step towards the pulpit, as if walking the shortest path but also the longest path of his life. He didn't bring a Bible, didn't prepare a sermon, just went up to sit down. For the first time, Jacob Carter sat in the very place his father had stood. But he didn't stand to raise his voice. He sat quietly, his back resting on the old wooden wall, his face looking up at the rays of light shining through the stained glass. No one called him to do that. There was no community looking, but he knew someone was watching. His father? Perhaps. God? He didn't need to be sure. The important thing was he no longer felt alone in the silence. Eli climbed up to sit next to him, his legs swinging off the pulpit. The boy asked softly, "If he doesn't speak, how do we know he is still there?" Jacob looked out the window. Outside, the old oak tree still stood. Birds flew across the sky. The sun was warmer than a few days ago, because he still makes everything move. like the sun, like the wind, like the fact that today you are sitting here. The boy smiled, resting his head on his shoulder. A wind chime in the hallway bumped lightly into each other, a small but clear echo. Jacob closed his eyes, as if listening to his father's last sermon, not in words, but in presence. He opened his eyes, not saying anything more, just whispering in his heart, to the one who had passed away, to the one who was living, to himself, who had just completed a journey longer than a quarter of a century to restore honor to his father and to the faith that had been dropped. He is there, keeping silent, but not leaving. And today, he has spoken, not with a voice, not with thunder, but with a child calling him father, with a grave with a real name, and with the light finally returning to this place.